Hello, romance lovers. If you're a fan of werewolf shifter romance audiobooks, you're in for a treat. This audiobook is packed with everything you crave: thrilling action, sizzling chemistry, and an irresistible alpha male at the center of it all. Whether you're here for the intense romance, the danger escape twists, or the supernatural allure of a gripping paranormal romance, this audiobook will have you hooked from the very first moment. It's the perfect escape into a world. So, grab your favorite drink, settle in, and let this steamy werewolf romance audiobook sweep you away. I promise it'll be an experience you won't forget. Press play, get comfortable, and let this werewolf shifter romance audiobook sweep you off your feet. Happy listening! Echoes of the Moon, written by Shelfie Bennett. Chapter 1. The air in the Moon Shadowpack's council hall was thick, heavy with the scent of aged oak and the faint tang of burning sage. The ancient table creaked under the weight of centuries-old treaty scrolls, their yellowed edges curling as though they too wanted to escape the room. I sat at the head of the table, back straight, hands clasped tight enough to crack knuckles. My gaze bore into the intricate wolf sigil embossed on the nearest scroll, but I barely saw it. My mind raced, clawing for a way out of this tangled mess. Across from me, Celine Voss leaned forward, her sharp silver eyes unyielding as moonlight reflected off a blade. Her fingers drummed a steady, mocking rhythm on the table. The woman was all sharp angles, farcighting gold ferocity, a walking embodiment of "don't mess with me." So Celine began, her voice as cool and cutting as a mountain wind. The mighty Alaric Kane finally graces us with his presence. Tell me, do you always sulk like this, or is it a special occasion? I dragged my gaze up to meet hers, schooling my features into the carefully neutral mask I wore so well. Some of us take treaties seriously, Celine. This isn't a casual dinner invitation. Her smirk widened, a flash of teeth that was more predator than pleasant. And some of us recognize when treaties are little more than leashes. Tell me, Alaric, do you enjoy being collared by tradition? Or is that just the Kane family way? I clenched my jaw, but before I could retort, she leaned back in her chair, folding her arms with calculated ease. Relax, Alpha. I don't bite much, but let's not pretend either of us wants this alliance. You're not pretending. That's for sure, I said dryly. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. I don't need a reluctant prince. I need a partner who can keep up. I leaned forward, bracing my elbows on the table as the tension coiled between us. You'll get an alpha who keeps his word. That should be enough. Her laugh was low and humorless, a sound that managed to echo despite the confined space. Enough for whom? Your pack? Or your ego? There it was, the jab meant to draw blood. I let it bounce off, though the effort made my teeth grind. For both our packs, I said evenly. Don't forget, Celine, we're playing the same game. You just prefer sharper claws. Her smile didn't falter, but her hands tightened imperceptibly against the table's edge. Fine, Alpha Kane. If we're playing games, let's play fair. Fair. The word tasted foreign, bitter. Nothing about this alliance was fair, but fairness had never been my luxury. I reached for the scroll, my fingers brushing the faded ink. The treaty was older than either of us, binding in ways that defied reason. Celine watched me, her gaze piercing, searching for a crack. Just remember, Alaric, the Moon Shadow Pack isn't the only one making sacrifices here. I stared back, refusing to flinch under her scrutiny. Trust me, Celine. No one's forgetting. Her smirk softened into something unreadable, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of something behind her armor. Doubt? Regret? It vanished too quickly to name. She stood abruptly, the scrape of her chair echoing like a challenge. Then I suppose we're done here, she said, voice cool again. For now, I replied, my tone matching hers. She turned, her sleek frame cutting through the room with a grace I could never hope to mimic. As the heavy doors creaked shut behind her, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. For now. This alliance might hold, but it would be a fragile thing, ready to snap at the first sign of weakness. And Celine Voss wasn't the type to let an advantage go unnoticed. The moment Celine swept out of the council hall, I slumped back in my chair, the rigid formality draining from my posture like water spilling from a cracked jug. The weight of the treaty scrolls still pressed against the table and against my skull, but at least I didn't have to stare into Celine's storm cloud eyes anymore. Not that my relief lasted long. Pups with her diplomacy and your temper. Now that sounds like a nightmare waiting to happen. I groaned, pinching the bridge of my nose. Gavin, don't you have a hobby? Something that doesn't involve driving me insane? My younger brother sauntered into the room, hands tucked casually into his jacket pockets, his grin as infuriatingly easygoing as ever. His shaggy blonde hair was perpetually tousled, like he'd just rolled out of bed or a fight, and the mischievous gleam in his hazel eyes told me he'd been eavesdropping. Again, who needs hobbies when you provide so much entertainment? He said, plopping into the chair Celine had vacated, propping his boots on the table, like he owned the place. Seriously though, you and Celine in the same room. Sparks flying everywhere. I thought the table might catch fire. It's called diplomacy, I muttered. Gavin snorted. Diplomacy? That's what you call her glaring daggers while you grumble like a kicked puppy. Yeah, sure, let's go with that. I shot him a withering look, but he was immune to my glowering, always had been. This is serious, Gavin. The alliance is about as stable as a stack of twigs in a windstorm, he interrupted. Which, by the way, is why I'm suggesting the pup angle. Nothing unites rival packs like adorable little heirs. You can thank me later when the peace treaty lasts longer than a week. My jaw tightened, and I fought the urge to chuck one of the heavy scrolls at his head. You're hilarious. Really. When you're done auditioning for court jester, maybe you can contribute something useful. Gavin leaned back, folding his arms behind his head. Oh, I am contributing. You need to lighten up, big brother. This whole brooding alpha shtick, it's getting old. I glanced at the door, half expecting Celine to storm back in and hear this nonsense. If Celine heard you, she'd probably agree with me, Gavin said, his grin widening. Not about the pups maybe, but definitely about the brooding. You're impossible, I muttered, and you're stuck with me. I shook my head, a reluctant smile tugging at the corners of my mouth, despite myself. Gavin always knew how to push my buttons, but he also had a knack for diffusing the tension before it swallowed me whole. He didn't realize it, probably wouldn't care if he did, but I was grateful. Fine, I said, standing and rolling up the nearest scroll. If you're done with your commentary, maybe you can make yourself useful and hold on. Let me guess, he said, cutting me off. Go check the perimeter? Spy on Celine? Or is this one of those fetch me coffee moments? Just get out of my sight before I decide to banish you. I shot back, my tone half serious. Gavin laughed, pushing off the table and heading for the door with a casual salute. You've got it, Alpha. The room felt quieter, too quiet once he left. I glanced at the scrolls one last time before letting out a heavy sigh. The treaty, the alliance, Celine, all of it loomed over me like a storm waiting to break. And somehow Gavin's quip about pups still lingered in the back of my mind. What a nightmare indeed. I took a long, steadying breath and reached for the carved wooden box at the center of the table. The weight of it was far greater than the polished cedar should have allowed, as if the centuries of tradition it carried had sunk into the grain. The door creaked open again, and Celine re-entered the room, with the kind of regal composure that made it impossible to believe she'd ever cracked a joke in her life. Her silver eyes flicked to the box in my hands, then back to my face. So, she said, her tone even but cool, are we doing this, or are you going to brood over the carvings for another hour? Just savoring the moment, I replied dryly. You know how I love ancient customs. Celine's lips curved into the faintest ghost of a smirk, sharp, fleeting, and gone before I could be sure it was ever there. She stepped closer, her movements deliberate, as if she were stalking prey. I opened the box and retrieved the token inside, a medallion, its surface etched with the entwined sigils of the Moonshadow and Nightfang packs. A full moon framed the design, gleaming faintly in the dim light of the hall. She extended her hand, palm up, and I hesitated a fraction longer than I should have. Her gaze didn't waver, her expression betraying nothing. Finally, I placed the medallion in her hand, our fingers brushing for the briefest moment. Her skin was cold expected, somehow but steady, unyielding. In return, she produced a similar token from a pouch at her side. The Nightfang Pack's emblem was centered, surrounded by crescent moons and stars. When she handed it to me, I felt the faint prickle of power in the metal, as if it recognized my touch. The weight of the exchange settled in the room, heavier than the silence that followed. I met Celine's gaze again, the unspoken challenge between us as loud as a wolf's howl. "It's done, then," she said, her voice carrying a finality that made my chest tighten. "For better or worse," I replied, my tone clipped. Celine turned the medallion over in her palm, her expression inscrutable. "Let's hope it's the former," she said softly, then slipped the token into the pouch and walked toward the door. This time I didn't stop her. I simply stood there, staring down at the medallion in my hand, as if it held answers to questions I wasn't ready to ask. The uneasy truce was solidified, the alliance bound by ancient tradition and brittle promises. But as I watched Celine's silhouette vanish through the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much bigger storm. The token's cool weight pressed into my palm, a reminder that peace, like alliances, often came with a price. And something told me we hadn't paid the full cost yet. The dog squirmed on the metal exam table, his scruffy fur matted with dirt and his brown eyes wide with terror. His left ear flopped at an odd angle, giving him a lopsided look that tugged at my heart. "Hold still, buddy," I murmured, tucking my auburn hair behind my ear with one hand, while I worked the needle with the other. "You've been through worse than a few stitches, I promise." "Talking to the patients again?" Sammy quipped from behind me, her voice lilting with amusement. "Should I start worrying about your social life?" I didn't have to look up to know she was grinning. "Why worry when you're here to keep me company?" I shot back, glancing over my shoulder at her. Sammy stood by the counter, a roll of gauze in one hand and her phone in the other. Her blonde ponytail bobbed as she chuckled. "True," she said, snapping a picture of the dog. "This guy's definitely going on our before and after wall. What are we calling him? Scrappy? Sir Wiggles?" I focused on tying off the final stitch before answering. "How about Houdini? He managed to get out of 2 traps and dodge animal control before winding up here." Sammy wrinkled her nose. "Whodunny? Too obvious. What about Sir Flops-a-Lot? Look at that ear." The dog whined softly, his tail giving a hesitant wag as if he understood he was the butt of the joke. "Sir Flops-a-Lot it is," I said with a laugh, running my fingers gently over his fur to check for other injuries. "What do you think, buddy? Fancy enough for you?" "He's a stray, Ella," Sammy pointed out, rolling her eyes. "He probably thinks Hey You is fancy." "Every dog deserves a title," I replied, scratching behind Sir Flops-a-Lot's good ear. He leaned into my touch, a soft whimper escaping his throat. Sammy set down the gauze and grabbed the treats from the cabinet. "You spoil them," she said, tossing me a piece of jerky. "Guilty," I said, holding the treat just out of reach, until the dog gave me his best puppy dog eyes. "But you're just mad you didn't think of it first," Sammy smirked, leaning against the counter. "I'll admit, you've got away with them. It's borderline magical." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help the small smile that tugged at my lips. "It's called patience, Sammy. You should try it sometime." "Patience isn't my style," she said breezily. "Charm maybe, wit definitely, but patience, hard pass." I finished cleaning up Sir Flops-a-Lot and handed him a second treat. He wagged his tail more confidently this time, his big, soulful eyes watching my every move. "There," I said, stepping back and wiping my hands on my scrubs. "He's all patched up. Now, let's see if we can find him a home before he decides to make a break for it." "Yeah, good luck with that," Sammy said, already scrolling through her phone. "If no one claims him, you know he's staying with you, right?" I shook my head, but I couldn't stop the grin from spreading across my face. "Don't start, Sammy. Too late." You're a sucker, Ella Harper, and everyone knows it, including Sir Flopsalot here. The dog barked, a high-pitched yip that sounded suspiciously like agreement. I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck as I glanced around the small, cluttered clinic. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And moments like these snappy banter, wagging tails, and the warmth of making a difference were the reason I wouldn't trade it for the world. Even if Sammy was right about me being a sucker, the clinic door banged open so hard I nearly dropped the gauze I was holding. Sammy let out a startled squeak, and I whirled around to see old man Carlos barreling in, red-faced and wild-eyed, his straw hat askew. "Ella, you've got to come quick," he shouted, clutching his chest dramatically like he was auditioning for the town theater. "It's Duchess, she's down in the field. And I think she's, oh Lord, I think she's dyin'." I was already pulling off my gloves. "What happened?" I asked, grabbing my kit from the counter. "She just collapsed," he said, pacing like a panicked rooster in a henhouse. One minute she was fine, the next she sprawled out, wheezing like a busted bellows. "Okay, calm down," I said, slinging the kit over my shoulder. "We'll sort it out. Sammy, keep an eye on Flopsalot while I'm gone." "You mean Sir Flopsalot," Sammy corrected, grinning despite the chaos. "Good luck saving the Duchess." The first rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling. "Thanks for the vote of confidence." Carlyle led me to the truck, and we bounced down the dirt road to his farm, his constant stream of muttered prayers doing little to steady my nerves. When we reached the field, I spotted Duchess, a magnificent dappled mare lying on her side, her chest heaving. "Duchess," the first murmured, crouching beside her. She blinked at me, her dark eyes glossy with pain. "Hey, girl. Let's see what's going on." Carlyle hovered anxiously. "She's my best horse, Ella. She's family." "I know," I said gently, pressing my stethoscope to her flank. Her heartbeat was erratic, but steady enough to keep me hopeful. "Let me work, okay?" As I examined her, the puzzle pieces started to click together. Her labored breathing, the bloated abdomen, it all screamed colic. "I think she's colicking," I told Carlyle. "She probably got into something she shouldn't have eaten. We'll need to relieve the pressure." "Can you fix her?" he asked, his voice shaking. "She's got a good shot," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. With Carlyle's help, I got Duchess upright, her legs trembling beneath her, and started the necessary treatment. It was messy work, involving a stomach tube, mineral oil, and a lot of patience. All the while Carlyle fretted like a nervous father-to-be. "She's strong," I reassured him. "She's going to pull through." Just as Duchess began to show signs of improvement, a low, mournful howl cut through the still evening air. I froze, the sound sending an unexpected shiver down my spine. "That doesn't sound like one of your dogs," I said, glancing toward the tree line. Carlyle shook his head. "Wolves," he muttered. "They've been gettin' bolder lately. Too bold, if you ask me." I tried to shake off the unease that settled over me. Wolves were just animals, same as any other. And yet, something about that howl lingered in my chest, heavy and strange. "Well," I said, forcing a smile as I patted Duchess's neck. "Good thing Duchess has me to keep the big bad wolves at bay, huh?" Carlyle chuckled, but I couldn't help glancing at the darkening forest again, my stomach gnawed for reasons I couldn't quite explain. By the time I got back to the clinic, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of burnt orange and deep indigo. Sammy had left for the night, leaving me alone with Sir Flopsalot, who was now snoozing in a makeshift bed of blankets in the corner. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over small towns after dark, calm and peaceful, but with just enough edge to keep you listening. I was just locking up the front door when I heard it. Scratch. I froze, my hand on the deadbolt. Scratch, scratch. The sound was faint but persistent, coming from the back door. Probably a raccoon or a stray cat. Still, it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. "Great," I muttered to myself, because tonight hasn't been exciting enough. Grabbing a flashlight, I tiptoed through the clinic, feeling a bit ridiculous for creeping around my own workspace. Sir Flopsalot perked his head up, his floppy ear twitching as he stared toward the sound. "Stay there," I told him, which was pointless since he didn't seem inclined to move anyway. The scratching came again, more insistent this time. My heart thumped a little faster as I unlocked the back door and swung it open. The flashlight beam swept over the empty alley behind the clinic. For a second, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, the beam landed on a dark shape slumped just outside the doorway. It was a wolf. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was huge, bigger than any wolf I'd ever seen in real life, with a thick coat of dark fur matted with blood. One of its forelegs was twisted at an unnatural angle, and its chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. "Well," I whispered, more to myself than to the wolf, "you're definitely not a raccoon." The wolf's ears twitched, and for a moment I swore its amber eyes flicked open to meet mine. They were piercing, intelligent, too intelligent. I hesitated, my instincts warring with my training. On one hand, this was a wild animal, and getting involved was probably a terrible idea. On the other hand, it was injured, and leaving it to die felt wrong. "Okay, big guy," I said softly, crouching down and keeping my movements slow. "I don't know how you got here, but you've got the right address. Let's see if I can help." The wolf didn't move as I dragged a blanket from the supply shelf and carefully draped it over him. His body was hot to the touch, his fur sticky with blood. "This is definitely above my pay grade," I muttered, grabbing my kit. "Sammy's going to kill me when she finds out." As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about him. He didn't flinch or growl, even when I cleaned his wounds. Instead, he watched me with those sharp amber eyes, as if he understood exactly what I was doing. "There," I said after what felt like an eternity, sitting back on my heels. "That should hold you together for now." The wolf let out a low, rumbling sound that might have been a growl or a laugh. "You're welcome," I said, rolling my eyes. "Next time, try not to pick a fight you can't win. Okay?" The wolf's eyes closed, and I thought he might be drifting off when he suddenly struggled to his feet, wobbling unsteadily. "Hooah, easy." I reached out, but he shook his head, and took a shaky step toward the door. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, blocking his path. "You can barely stand. Where are you planning to go, huh?" "Back into the woods so you can bleed out in peace." The wolf huffed, and if wolves could roll their eyes, I was pretty sure he just did. Before I could stop him, he nudged past me, limping into the alley. "Unbelievable," I muttered, watching as he disappeared into the shadows. For a moment I stood there, staring after him, the strange encounter playing on a loop in my head. Then, somewhere in the distance, another wolf howled a long, mournful sound that sent a shiver down my spine. "Definitely above my pay grade," I whispered, closing the door and locking it tight. I stayed crouched in the doorway, flashlight trembling just enough to make me feel ridiculous. The wolf's growl rumbled low and steady, a warning wrapped in pain, and I swallowed hard. His amber eyes locked on me, sharp and burning, daring me to try something stupid. "Look, I get it," I said, keeping my voice soft. "You're having a bad day. Probably a bad week, maybe even a bad life. But here's the thing, I'm not the enemy." The growl softened, more of a warning purr now, and I took that as encouragement. Slowly I set the flashlight on the ground and grabbed the blanket I'd draped over his back. "Don't bite me, okay?" I murmured, my hands steady but my heart hammering. "I mean, I'd probably taste terrible, and trust me, I'm not in the mood to explain a wolf bite to Dr. Langston." He didn't snap, though his ears flicked back, and his breathing hitched when I touched the torn fur around his shoulder. The gash was deep, oozing blood that matted his coat and stuck to my gloves. I winced. "Yikes. You really went all in, huh? Who did this to you? Another wolf? A bear? The forest mafia?" His eyes narrowed, and for a split second, I could have sworn he was insulted. "Okay, no jokes," I said quickly. "Noted." I cleaned the wound as gently as I could, muttering soothing nonsense under my breath. "You're tougher than you look, you know. A lot of wolves wouldn't even make it this far. But you're out here growling at me, still standing well, sort of. That's impressive. The wolf let out a huff somewhere between a sigh and a scoff. Hey, I'm serious, I said, dabbing the torn flesh with antiseptic. You've got grit, big guy. But grit only gets you so far. You've got to let someone help you once in a while. Otherwise, you're just a stubborn mess bleeding all over somebody's doorstep. He went still, his chest rising and falling in shallow pants. For a moment, I thought I might have overstepped. Then his amber eyes shifted, meeting mine with a look so piercing, so unnervingly human, that it stole the breath from my lungs. It wasn't just the pain or the fear, it was something deeper, something ancient and unspoken, like he was trying to tell me something important without words. The moment broke when he shifted, wincing as he pulled his leg closer to his body. Okay, fine, I said, pulling back. I'll take that as thank you, Ella, for saving my life. You're welcome, by the way. I reached for a clean bandage, but he surprised me by pushing himself upright. Hey, easy there. I held up my hands, unsure whether I was trying to calm him or myself. You're not exactly in marathon shape, buddy. The wolf ignored me. He wobbled on his unsteady legs, his head low, and started limping toward the alley. You've got to be kidding me, I muttered, scrambling to block his path. You're seriously just going to walk away? After I just risked my fingers to keep you in one piece? He paused, looking at me over his shoulder. That same burning gaze locked onto mine again, softer this time, almost grateful. Fine, I said, throwing my hands up. Be mysterious and broody, see if I care. Just don't let me find you back here tomorrow in worse shape, or I'm charging you for the supplies. The wolf made a sound that was almost a chuckle, low and rumbling, then turned and limped into the darkness. I stood there in the doorway, my arms crossed, watching until he disappeared into the shadows. Unbelievable, I muttered, shaking my head. The alley was quiet again, but the weight of his stare lingered in the back of my mind, warm and unsettling all at once. Something told me that wouldn't be the last I'd see of him. And for reasons I couldn't quite explain, the thought wasn't as alarming as it should have been. Chapter 2. The early morning sunlight dappled the forest floor, filtering through the canopy in golden streaks that made everything look like it belonged in a fairy tale. Ella Harper adjusted the strap of her camera bag, her boots crunching softly against the undergrowth as she wandered deeper into the woods. She stopped to snap a photo of a curious squirrel perched on a branch, its tail twitching as it stared back at her. Don't worry, I'm not here to steal your acorns, she said aloud, her voice breaking the silence of the forest. Solitude had its perks, she decided. No deadlines, no panicked farmers, and most importantly, no judgmental side eyes from Sammy about her tendency to talk to animals like they were old friends. The woods were her escape, a place where she could breathe without the weight of responsibilities pressing down on her chest. Today, she needed it more than ever. The events of the previous night still played on a loop in her mind. The injured wolf, its piercing gaze, the way it had limped off into the night like some tragic hero in an old legend. She shook her head, trying to clear the image. Not my circus, not my wolf, she muttered, lifting her camera to focus on a particularly gnarly tree root that had twisted into a shape resembling a claw. Click. Ella moved further into the forest, her steps slow and deliberate as she scanned the area for her next subject. She hadn't meant to stray this far from the usual trails, but the morning was too beautiful to resist, and her curiosity had a way of leading her off course. Unbeknownst to her, the subtle markers that divided human territory from werewolf lands were well behind her now. The attack came without warning. One moment, Ella was crouched, trying to capture a close-up of a tiny patch of moss glowing emerald in the sunlight. The next, a low growl rumbled from the underbrush, freezing her in place. She turned her head slowly, her heart thudding in her chest as her gaze landed on a pair of yellow eyes gleaming from the shadows. Before she could even process the danger, a rogue wolf exploded from the undergrowth, its teeth bared and its body moving with terrifying speed. Ella stumbled backward, her camera clattering to the ground as she threw her arms up instinctively. Oh no, bad wolf. Very bad wolf. The wolf lunged, but before it could reach her, A dark blur barreled into it with the force of a freight train. The impact sent both wolves tumbling across the forest floor in a flurry of snapping jaws and tangled limbs. Ella scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps as she watched the scene unfold. The second wolf was massive, its dark fur glinting in the sunlight as it moved with brutal efficiency. It was clear within moments that this was no ordinary animal. Every movement was calculated, every strike precise. Ella's legs locked beneath her, as the larger wolf, her wolf, she realized with a bizarre sense of certainty, pinned the rogue to the ground with a vicious snarl. The rogue struggled for a moment before yelping and darting back into the shadows, its tail tucked firmly between its legs. For a few heartbeats, the dark wolf stood still, its head low and its teeth bared as it stared after the retreating rogue. Then it turned, its amber eyes locking onto Ella. She froze, her pulse racing as the realization sank in. "Oh," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's you." The wolf tilted its head slightly, its gaze unreadable, before taking a cautious step toward her. "Okay," Ella said, holding up her hands like she was trying to calm a particularly skittish horse. "Let's not make this weirder than it already is. You just saved my life, and I'm grateful. Super grateful. But maybe don't eat me now, okay?" The wolf huffed a sound that was almost exasperated and took another step forward. Ella blinked. "What is it with you and dramatic entrances? Are you trying to give me a heart attack, or is this just your thing?" The wolf sat back on its haunches, still watching her with that intense, almost human focus. Ella exhaled shakily, lowering her hands. "You're not going to hurt me, are you?" she asked softly. The wolf's ears flicked, and for a moment she could have sworn it was shaking its head. "Right," she said, her voice steadier now. "I guess we're even then. You saved me, I patched you up. Let's call it square." The wolf let out a low growl, not threatening, more like agreement, before turning and loping off into the woods. Ella stood there for a long moment, staring after him. Then she glanced down at her camera, still lying in the dirt, and let out a shaky laugh. "Next time," she said to no one in particular, "I'm bringing pepper spray." The woods fell eerily silent after the rogue wolf retreated, the quiet pressing in on Ella like the dense forest canopy above. She took an unsteady step backward, her fingers brushing against the bark of a tree for support. Her eyes were glued to the dark wolf that had saved her, a wolf she now realized wasn't entirely, well, a wolf. Her savior stood motionless, amber eyes locked on her with an intensity that felt almost tangible. But then, something changed. The wolf let out a low, guttural sound, not quite a growl, and its body began to shift. At first, Ella thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, but the air around the wolf shimmered like heat waves rising from pavement. And then it happened. Fur melted away to reveal skin. Joints cracked and reformed, limbs stretching and twisting in ways that made Ella's stomach flip. The wolf's snout shortened into a strong jawline, and its ears shifted to a familiar human shape. The entire transformation took mere seconds, but to Ella, it felt like a surreal eternity. When it was over, she found herself staring not at a hulking wolf but at a man. A very naked man. Ella stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a yelp. The man's dark hair was disheveled, his broad shoulders heaving with the effort of the shift. His amber eyes, still unsettlingly intense, met hers, and for a heartbeat neither of them spoke. "Well," she finally managed, her voice high-pitched and shaky, "this is new." The man raised an eyebrow, as if her reaction amused him. "You're human," she blurted, then winced. "I mean, obviously you're not just human, but you can change into a wolf. Which is," she gestured vaguely, her mind scrambling for coherent words, "totally normal. Happens all the time." He took a step toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was trying not to spook her. "Are you done?" he asked, his voice deep and calm. Ella's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She pointed a trembling finger at him instead, then hastily averted her gaze. Clothes. You might want to." The man looked down at himself and gave a faint, humorless laugh. "Right. Forgot about that part. Ella let out a strangled noise that might have been a laugh if she weren't so busy trying to process what she'd just witnessed. You forgot? Do you do this often? Only when necessary, he replied smoothly, crouching to grab a loose branch from the forest floor. He snapped it in half, more for something to do than any practical purpose. Right. Necessary? She said, her voice thick with disbelief. Because battling a rabid wolf and then, that was totally on my bingo card for today. You're welcome, by the way, he said, his tone dry as he met her wide-eyed gaze again. Ella blinked. For what? For saving your life. Her cheeks flushed, and she crossed her arms. I wasn't in that much danger. He tilted his head, his expression a mix of amusement and exasperation. You were standing in rogue territory with no weapon, no plan, and absolutely no idea what you were dealing with. She opened her mouth to argue but found she didn't have a leg to stand on. Fine, she said, throwing her hands up. Thanks for the rescue. Now, can someone please explain to me why werewolves are suddenly real and why no one bothered to send me a memo? The man smirked a faint, lopsided thing that made him look almost boyish despite the situation. It's a long story. Well, Ella said, planting her hands on her hips, lucky for you. I've got nothing but time. The man sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as if he already regretted the impending conversation. This is going to be interesting. Ella couldn't help but laugh loud, bright, and maybe a little hysterical. Oh, buddy, she said, shaking her head. You have no idea. Ella stood rooted to the spot, her hands planted on her hips, as she eyed the man-wolf, standing before her. He had the audacity to look entirely unbothered, despite the fact that he had just shifted from a snarling wolf into a very naked, very human figure right in front of her. Let me get this straight, she said, breaking the silence. You just swoop in, save the day, scare off a rogue wolf, and then stand there like this is just a Tuesday for you. Alaric arched a dark brow, his amber eyes gleaming with quiet amusement. It's a little more common than you'd think, Ella snorted, crossing her arms. Well, lucky me. It's not every day my knight in furry armor shows up uninvited. His lips twitched, almost forming a smile. Knight in furry armor? She gestured vaguely toward the spot where the rogue wolf had disappeared. You're out here saving damsels in distress, growling at bad guys. What else am I supposed to call you? Sir Growls a lot? He let out a low chuckle, the sound rich and surprisingly warm. I'd prefer Alaric. Alaric, she repeated, testing the name like it might have Thorns. Right. Well, Alaric, I don't know if anyone's told you, but the whole heroic rescue thing is a bit more charming when you're, clothed. He raised both hands in mock surrender. Noted. Ella shook her head, a grin tugging at the corners of her lips, despite the absurdity of the situation. And here I thought today was going to be boring. Thanks for proving me wrong. You're welcome, he said smoothly, his expression serious despite the playful glint in his eyes. She tilted her head, studying him like a particularly challenging puzzle. Do you always make such dramatic entrances? Or am I just special? Depends, he said, his voice taking on a teasing edge. Are you always wandering into dangerous territory without a clue? Ella's jaw dropped, a mock gasp escaping her. Excuse me. I'll have you know I am perfectly capable of getting yourself mauled by a rogue wolf, Alaric finished, one brow quirking upward. She narrowed her eyes, pointing a finger at him. Careful, Alaric. You're dangerously close to ruining the whole knight in furry armor thing you've got going. He chuckled again, the sound more relaxed this time, and for a moment, the tension that had gripped the forest seemed to dissolve. Ella crossed her arms again, her grin softening into something more curious. So, what's the deal anyway? Do I owe you a favor now? Is there a wolf code about rescuing random humans? Alaric's expression grew thoughtful, his gaze flickering toward the darkened woods as if weighing his answer. Let's just say I was in the right place at the right time. She frowned, not entirely convinced. And this is just normal for you? He smirked, a slow, confident thing that made her stomach flip in a way she absolutely refused to acknowledge. You'd be surprised. Ella rolled her eyes, but the smile lingered on her face. Well, Sir growls a lot. I hope you're ready for some questions. Because I've got about 100 of them. Starting with, what the heck is going on? Alaric tilted his head, his expression unreadable but faintly amused. Only 100. Oh, don't worry, Ella shot back, her grin widening. That's just the warm-up. For a moment they stood there, the forest humming quietly around them as if holding its breath. It was absurd, surreal, and entirely too much to process. And yet, Ella couldn't help but think she'd stumbled into a story she wasn't ready to leave just yet. Alaric's expression shifted as the playful edge melted away, replaced by something heavier. His amber eyes darkened, and the easy smirk that had been teasing at the corners of his mouth vanished. Ella, he said, his voice low and steady, you shouldn't be here. Her smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. What do you mean? It's just a forest. It's not just a forest, he said sharply, his gaze flicking to the shadows behind her. This place, it's dangerous. And not just because of the rogue wolves. She frowned, crossing her arms, as if bracing herself against the weight of his words. Look, I didn't exactly plan for a rogue wolf attack. I was just wandering into territory you don't understand, he interrupted, his tone firmer now. This isn't a place for humans, Ella. Not at night, not alone. Her brows shot up at the word humans, but before she could unpack the implications, his gaze locked onto hers. You need to leave, Alaric continued, his voice softer now but no less serious. For your own safety. Ella studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing as if trying to solve a particularly tricky riddle. You keep saying that, but you're not exactly giving me a lot of reasons to believe you. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, she thought he might snap at her. But then his gaze softened, lingering on her face longer than necessary, and she felt her heart skip a beat. I don't have time to explain, he said finally, his voice quieter but no less insistent. You just have to trust me. Trust you, she echoed, a skeptical eyebrow arching. You just turned into a wolf in front of me. That's not exactly a great foundation for trust, you know. Alaric's lips twitched, as if her defiance amused him despite himself. Fair point, he admitted. Ella tilted her head, watching him closely. So, what is it then? Am I trespassing? Breaking some ancient wolf rule? Or are you just this grumpy with everyone? For the briefest moment, something like a smile flickered across his face before he masked it with a stern expression. It's not about rules. It's about survival. His words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, but the way his gaze lingered on her made Ella wonder if there was more to it than just survival. Fine, she said, throwing her hands up in mock surrender. I'll go. But only because you're making it weird. It's already weird, he muttered under his breath, glancing toward the treetops as if asking the universe for patience. Ella bit back a laugh, turning to pick up her camera from where it had fallen. Dusting it off, she glanced over her shoulder at him. You know, you're not great at this whole warning thing. You should really work on your delivery. His expression softened for a moment, and he almost looked like he was about to smile again. But then he straightened, his tone firm as he said, Just get home safe, Ella. She paused, caught off guard by the way her name sounded in his voice like a secret he wasn't supposed to know. Sure thing, Sir growls a lot, she quipped, her grin returning as she started to walk away. But next time, you owe me an explanation. And maybe a shirt. Alaric watched her go, his amber eyes following her retreating figure until she disappeared into the trees. Only then did he let out a quiet sigh, running a hand through his disheveled hair. This is going to be trouble, he muttered to himself. But the faint, lingering smile on his face betrayed the fact that he didn't entirely mind. Ella wasn't sure what surprised her more, that she'd just been saved by a man who could turn into a wolf, or that she wasn't sprinting for the hills like a normal person. Instead, she found herself falling into step beside him as he guided her out of the forest, his pace slow and deliberate. So, she said after a beat of silence, glancing up at him with a crooked smile. Is this where you tell me I'm part of some ancient prophecy or something? Alaric didn't even break stride, though the corner of his mouth twitched. No prophecies, he said dryly. Just common sense. You shouldn't be out here alone. Right? Because rogue wolves and werewolves are such common threats these days, she shot back, stepping over a gnarled root. Should I also be worried about vampires and trolls? Maybe a dragon or two? His lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't miss the way his shoulders stiffened. Wait, she said, stopping in her tracks. Don't tell me dragons are real too. No dragons, he said quickly, his voice a touch too flat to be reassuring. Oh my God, she gasped, grinning as she fell back into step beside him. You're such a bad liar. You totally hesitated. I did not, he replied, his tone clipped. You did. Just a little. She gestured with her fingers to emphasize the point. Now I'm going to have to start carrying fireproof gear on my hikes. Thanks a lot. Alaric sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. Do you always talk this much? Only when I'm nervous or curious, she said brightly. And right now I'm a little bit of both. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, the amber gleam in his gaze catching the fading light. Curiosity can get you killed in a place like this. Ella shrugged, unfazed. Maybe. Or it could get me answers. Like, how long have you been doing the whole wolf-to-man thing? Is it hereditary? Do you have a tail when you shift? Please tell me you have a tail. Alaric stopped abruptly, turning to face her with an expression that fell somewhere between exasperation and amusement. You're unbelievable. Thank you, she said with a grin, clearly not taking the hint. He shook his head, muttering something under his breath that she couldn't quite catch. When he started walking again, she followed, her camera bag bouncing against her side as she struggled to keep up with his longer strides. You know, she said, her tone turning softer, you didn't have to save me back there. His steps faltered for a split second, but he didn't look at her. I couldn't let you get hurt. Her chest tightened unexpectedly at the quiet sincerity in his voice. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, suddenly unsure of how to respond. Well, she said after a moment, trying to keep her tone light, I guess I owe you one. Maybe next time I can save you from something. A rabid squirrel, maybe. Alaric finally glanced at her, the barest hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. I'll hold you to that. They walked the rest of the way in a surprisingly comfortable silence, the forest growing less dense as the trail opened up into a clearing. When they reached the edge of the woods, he stopped, his gaze scanning the horizon. This is as far as I go. Ella turned to face him, her smile softening. No dramatic farewell. No mysterious warning about staying out of trouble. His smirk widened slightly. Stay out of trouble, Ella. She grinned, taking a step backward. You really need to work on your originality. He watched her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, before turning and disappearing back into the trees. Ella stood there for a long moment, staring after him. Then she let out a soft laugh, shaking her head as she started down the path. Werewolves, she muttered under her breath, a bemused smile on her face. What a day. Chapter 3. The Alpha's dilemma. Alaric paced the length of his cabin, the steady rhythm of his boots against the worn wooden floor, doing nothing to quiet the storm in his head. The encounter with Ella replayed in his mind, each moment more vivid than the last, her fearless curiosity, her sharp wit, the way she managed to look entirely unimpressed by a rogue wolf attack, and his mid-battle transformation. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever met. That's the problem, he muttered under his breath, raking a hand through his already disheveled hair. She's exactly the problem. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the crackling fireplace that did little to chase away the shadows creeping into his thoughts. He tried to shake it off, tried to focus on the bigger issues at hand, like rogue wolves invading their territory, but his mind kept wandering back to her, her wide, teasing grin. The way she said his name, like it was both a challenge and a question. He stopped abruptly, gripping the back of a chair as if it might ground him. Get a grip, he growled to himself. Talking to yourself now? Alaric stiffened at the familiar voice and turned to see his younger brother, Gavin, leaning casually against the doorframe, his hazel eyes alight with mischief. "What do you want, Gavin?" Alaric asked, his tone clipped. Gavin pushed off the doorframe and strolled into the room, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "Oh, nothing much," he said, his grin widening. "Just wanted to check on my dear big brother. You know, the one who's been pacing like a lovesick pup for the past hour." "I'm not pacing," Alaric snapped, though the floorboards told a different story. "Right?" Gavin drawled, flopping into the nearest chair. "And I suppose that scowl you've been wearing all day has nothing to do with a certain human?" Alaric's jaw tightened, but he didn't take the bait. "You should be more concerned about the rogue wolves," he said, deflecting. Gavin smirked, clearly unfazed. "Oh, I'm plenty concerned. But let's be honest, they're not the reason you're brooding like some tragic hero in a bad romance novel." "I'm not brooding." "Sure you're not," Gavin said, leaning back with an exaggerated sigh. "You're just thinking intensely about her, with that dreamy, faraway look in your eyes." Alaric shot him a glare sharp enough to cut through steel, but Gavin only chuckled. "Careful, big brother," Gavin said, his grin turning downright wicked. "Your tail's showing." Alaric pinched the bridge of his nose, counting silently to 10. "I don't have time for this." "Of course you don't," Gavin said, sitting up and resting his elbows on his knees. "You're too busy convincing yourself that she's just some random human who wandered into our territory by mistake. Except we both know that's not true, don't we?" Alaric didn't answer, his silence telling enough. Gavin tilted his head, his teasing tone softening just a fraction. "You like her, don't you?" "She's a human," Alaric said, his voice low. "She doesn't belong in our world." Gavin studied him for a moment, his usual smirk giving way to something more thoughtful. "Maybe she doesn't," he said finally. "But you can't pretend she doesn't matter. Not to you." Alaric didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the flames dancing in the fireplace. Gavin stood, clapping a hand on his shoulder as he passed. "Just think about it," he said, his voice lighter now. "And maybe try not to scare her off next time. You're terrible at first impressions." Alaric shot him a look, but Gavin was already halfway out the door, his laughter echoing behind him. Left alone once more, Alaric let out a heavy sigh and resumed his pacing, the image of Ella's curious, defiant smile etched firmly in his mind. Gavin leaned casually against the doorframe, arms crossed, his smirk ever present. Alaric had stopped pacing, but his shoulders were still tense, his grip on the back of the chair tightening, as if it might snap under his fingers. "You know," Gavin said, his voice light but tinged with a warning edge. "Celine isn't exactly the forgiving type. She's not going to take kindly to distractions." Alaric's head snapped up, his amber eyes narrowing. "She's not a distraction." Gavin raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Could have fooled me. You've been stomping around this cabin like a wolf with a thorn in his paw, ever since you dragged that human out of the woods." "She wasn't dragged," Alaric said through gritted teeth. Gavin pushed off the doorframe, strolling further into the room. "Fine. Escorted. Whatever you want to call it. The point is, Celine's not going to care about the details. She's going to see it as you shirking your responsibilities." "This has nothing to do with her," Alaric shot back, his voice sharper than he intended. "Oh, but it does," Gavin countered, his smirk fading. "Celine didn't agree to this alliance just for the fun of it. She's got her eye on the bigger picture, and she's counting on you to hold up your end of the bargain." Alaric bristled, the weight of those words settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew Gavin wasn't wrong. Celine wasn't the kind of alpha who overlooked perceived slights, especially ones that might threaten her plans. "I'm not backing out of the alliance," Alaric said firmly. "No," Gavin said, his tone unusually serious now. "But you're walking a fine line, big brother. If Celine gets even the faintest whiff of anything that looks like a distraction—" "She's not a distraction," Alaric interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. "Sure," Gavin said, lifting his hands in mock surrender. "If that's what helps you sleep at night." Alaric glared at him, the tension between them crackling like static electricity. But Gavin's expression softened slightly, and he placed a hand on Alaric's shoulder. "Just be careful," Gavin said, his voice quieter now. "Celine's not someone you want as an enemy. And if you're not careful, you're going to make her one." Alaric didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames in the fireplace. Gavin gave his shoulder a light squeeze before stepping back toward the door. "Anyway, I've said my piece. Try not to brood too hard. You'll scare the wolves." With that, Gavin turned and sauntered out of the room, leaving Alaric alone with his thoughts. For a long moment, Alaric didn't move. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the otherwise silent cabin. Gavin's words lingered, unwelcome but undeniable, and Alaric felt the weight of them settle like a stone in his chest. Celine wouldn't take kindly to distractions or to Ella, and the worst part, he wasn't entirely sure if he could keep her out of it. The heavy oak doors to Alaric's cabin swung open with a creak that seemed deliberately ominous. Celine Voss stepped inside, her silver eyes scanning the room with the precision of a predator surveying its prey. She didn't wait for an invitation, she never did. "Still hiding in your cave, Kane?" she said, her tone sharp enough to cut through the thick tension that always seemed to follow her. Alaric, who had been leaning against the stone mantel of the fireplace, didn't bother turning around. He stared into the flickering flames, his brooding silhouette practically etched into the stonework. "Better company here than out there," he replied, his voice low and even, with just a hint of sarcasm. Celine let out a dry laugh, the sound mirthless as she stepped further into the room, her boots clicking against the wooden floor. Charming as always. Alaric finally turned, his amber eyes meeting her silver ones. The weight of her presence filled the room, and he straightened instinctively, his expression unreadable. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" he asked, folding his arms across his chest. Celine tilted her head, her sleek braid falling over one shoulder as she studied him. "The alliance," she said pointedly. "You've been distant." "Have I?" he said, his tone feigning innocence. "Yes," she shot back, narrowing her eyes. "You're not exactly subtle, Kane. Do you think I don't notice when you disappear? Or when the rogues start encroaching on our borders while you're busy brooding in the woods?" He frowned, his jaw tightening. "The rogues are my problem. I don't need a reminder." Her lips curved into a wry smile. "You're welcome, then? Consider it a free service?" They stared at each other for a moment, the tension between them palpable, like the charged air before a storm. But then Celine's smirk faltered. Just a fraction, and she turned away, her gaze drifting to the window where the forest stretched endlessly beyond. "Do you think I want this?" she asked quietly, her voice losing some of its sharpness. Alaric blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in her tone. "What?" "This alliance," she said, still staring out the window. "Do you think I want to tie my pack's fate to yours? To anyone's?" He didn't answer, unsure where she was going with this. Celine let out a sigh, crossing her arms as she leaned against the windowsill. "I didn't claw my way to the top of my pack just to have every decision I make questioned, because I'm not him." Alaric tilted his head, his brow furrowing. "Not who?" She turned back to face him, her expression hardening again, but not before he caught the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "My father," she said simply. It hit him like a weight. Celine rarely, if ever, spoke about her father, the former alpha of the Nightfang pack, a man whose legacy cast a long shadow over her leadership. "Celine, don't," she said quickly, cutting him off. Her silver eyes flashed with defiance, though her voice was steadier now. "I don't need your pity, Kane. I just need you to hold up your end of this alliance." Alaric studied her, his usual sharp retorts fading as he saw her for what she was in that moment, not just an alpha, but a leader carrying the weight of expectations she hadn't asked for. "You're doing fine," he said quietly. She scoffed, the sound brittle. "Don't patronize me." "I'm not," he said firmly, stepping closer. "You've got more fight in you than most alphas I've met, Celine. If your father were still around, I think he'd be proud." Her eyes widened, just a little, before narrowing again as she straightened her posture. "Flattery doesn't suit you, Kane." "It wasn't flattery," he said, his tone matter of fact. They stood there in silence, the unspoken weight of their shared burdens filling the space between them. Finally, Celine shook her head and stepped away from the window, her usual sharpness sliding back into place like armor. "Just remember," she said as she moved toward the door, "this alliance isn't just about your pack or mine. It's about survival. Don't let anything or anyone jeopardize that." She didn't wait for a response before walking out, the door swinging shut behind her with a heavy thud. Alaric stood alone, her words lingering in the air like smoke. He stared at the door for a long moment, the weight of her warning settling heavily on his shoulders. "Easier said than done," he muttered, turning back to the fire. The forest was bathed in an otherworldly glow, the kind of silver light that seemed to hum just beneath her skin. Ella wandered through it, her steps light but aimless, the leaves underfoot crunching softly like whispers. She wasn't sure where she was going, only that she was being drawn forward. The air was thick with a strange electric energy, and shadows danced at the edges of her vision, moving in sync with the faint rustling of the trees. Then she saw them, two glowing amber eyes piercing the darkness ahead. They were unblinking, impossibly vivid, and filled with a strange intensity that made her stomach flip. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling but steady enough to echo through the stillness. The eyes didn't blink. As she stepped closer, a chorus of whispers rose around her, low and melodic, like a breeze weaving through ancient trees. "The healer? The bond chosen?" Ella spun around, searching for the source of the voices, but the forest was empty save for the glowing eyes that watched her with unsettling focus. "What does that mean?" she demanded, her voice louder now. "What bond? Who's the healer?" The whispers grew louder, overlapping and swirling together in a chaotic harmony. "You must find it, protect it. The bond will save or break." Suddenly, the light in the forest dimmed, the glowing eyes vanishing like snuffed-out flames. Darkness rushed in, swallowing everything, and Ella felt herself falling endlessly, her heart pounding in her chest as the whispers reached a crescendo. Ella jolted awake, her breath coming in sharp gasps as her heart thundered in her ears. The familiar walls of her bedroom came into focus, the soft glow of her bedside lamp casting comforting shadows on the pale blue wallpaper. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to calm her racing heart. That dream, it had felt so real. The whispers still echoed faintly in her mind, their cryptic words swirling together like smoke. As her breathing slowed, she became aware of something else, a faint, warm light emanating from her chest. Her gaze dropped, and she froze. The necklace around her neck, a simple silver chain with an opalescent pendant that had belonged to her grandmother, was glowing faintly. "What the?" she whispered, her fingers trembling as they brushed the cool metal of the chain. The pendant pulsed gently, the light fading in and out like a heartbeat. It wasn't bright, just enough to cast a soft glow against her skin, but it sent a chill down her spine nonetheless. She clutched the pendant tightly, as if holding onto it might anchor her in reality. This had to be a trick of the light, or maybe her mind playing games with her after that dream. But deep down, she knew better. Her grandmother had always said the necklace was special, though Ella had assumed she meant it in the sentimental sense. "Keep it close, darling," her grandmother had told her more than once. "You'll understand one day." Ella swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the pendant. "Looks like today's the day," she muttered, her voice shaky but laced with the wry humor that always surfaced when things got too strange to handle. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet brushing the cool wooden floor as she stood. The whispers from the dream still lingered in her mind, their cryptic urgency impossible to ignore. The healer. The bond. What did it all mean? And why did she feel like she was about to find out? Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Surface. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Ella's boots crunched against the undergrowth, the sound loud in the stillness. She had no idea why she was out here again, especially after her run-in with the rogue wolf and the far more intriguing Alaric. Yet something pulled her forward, an invisible thread tugging her deeper into the woods. The pendant around her neck felt warm against her skin, almost as if it were guiding her. "Okay, this is fine," she muttered to herself, her voice barely more than a whisper. Totally normal to wander into the forest after a cryptic dream and a glowing necklace. Nothing weird about this at all. The trees parted abruptly, and Ella stepped into a small glade bathed in soft, silvery moonlight. The grass shimmered like frost under the pale glow, and the air was thick with a strange energy that made her skin prickle. In the center of the glade, a figure crouched low, half hidden by shadows. Ella froze, her breath catching in her throat as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. It was a wolf. No, it wasn't quite a wolf. Its shape flickered, shifting in and out of focus like a poorly tuned radio. One moment it had a sleek, lupine form, and the next, the broad shoulders of a man. The transformation was mesmerizing and unsettling all at once. Bones cracked and reshaped, fur melted into skin, and claws gave way to human fingers. The creature or man let out a low growl that sent a shiver racing down Ella's spine. It wasn't until the transformation slowed that Ella realized exactly who she was looking at. "Alaric," she whispered, her voice trembling more from shock than fear. His head snapped up, his amber eyes locking onto hers, glowing faintly in the moonlight. For a moment neither of them moved, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. "Ella," he said, his voice rough, caught somewhere between a growl and a plea. She stumbled back a step, her hand instinctively clutching the pendant around her neck. "So you really do that?" Alaric straightened, his bare chest rising and falling with deep, steady breaths. His gaze never left hers, the intensity in his eyes holding her in place even as every instinct screamed at her to run. "I told you it was dangerous out here," he said, his voice low and steady now, though his expression was anything but calm. She huffed out a laugh, though it came out shakier than she'd intended. "You did. What you didn't tell me was that you moonlight as an actual werewolf. Kind of an important detail, don't you think?" He took a cautious step toward her, his movements careful, like he was approaching a skittish animal. "It's not something people usually take well." "Well," she said, forcing her voice to stay light even as her heart raced, "lucky for you, I'm not most people." Alaric's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smile flickering across his face before he caught himself. "You're not afraid." Ella's grip on her necklace tightened as she lifted her chin. "Not yet. Should I be?" He sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair as he muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, "You're impossible." When he met her gaze again, his expression was unreadable, a strange mix of resignation and admiration. "No," he said quietly, "you shouldn't be." She studied him for a long moment, her thoughts racing. There were 100 questions buzzing in her mind, but none of them made it past her lips. Instead, she took a tentative step forward, her head tilting as she looked him over. "Well," she said with a wry smile, "I've got to admit, your dramatic entrances make a lot more sense now." He let out a soft laugh, the sound surprising even him. "You're handling this better than I expected." Ella shrugged, her grin widening. "What can I say? I'm adaptable." But even as she joked, her mind lingered on the raw power she'd seen in his transformation, the way his body had shifted, caught between two worlds. It was both terrifying and fascinating, and she couldn't quite decide which one won out. Alaric watched her carefully, his gaze never wavering. "You should leave, Ella. This place, it's not safe for you." Her smile softened, but she didn't back away. "Neither are you, I think." For a moment they stood there, the glade silent around them. The unspoken weight of what had just happened settled between them like a fragile thread, connecting their worlds in a way that neither of them fully understood. And for the first time, Ella wasn't sure if she wanted to walk away. Ella's lips twitched, her initial shock melting into something softer, warmer. She studied Alaric standing before her with his chest heaving and tension radiating from every inch of him. And then she did what she always did when things got too strange to process. She cracked a joke. "Well," she said, crossing her arms and tilting her head, "that was quite the extreme makeover. Do you always go for the midnight wolf to man look? Or is this just a special occasion?" Alaric blinked, his brows furrowing as though he hadn't quite heard her correctly. What? She continued, waving a hand in his direction. The whole dramatic transformation thing. It's very cinematic. 10 out of 10 for style points, though the fur transition could use a little work. He stared at her, clearly trying to decide if she was serious. You're joking, he said flatly. Of course I'm joking. Ella shot back, throwing her hands up. What else am I supposed to do? Start screaming? Faint? I feel like that'd be way less helpful. Alaric let out a soft, incredulous laugh, more of a huff, really, and shook his head. You're unbelievable. Thank you, she said, beaming as though he'd just paid her the highest compliment. His lips twitched again, and for a moment she thought he might actually smile. But the tension in his shoulders didn't entirely ease, and his gaze remained sharp, scanning her face for any sign of fear. You're not scared, he said finally, as if testing the words out loud. Should I be? She asked, raising an eyebrow. That depends, he replied, his tone soft but laced with a hint of warning. Most people don't exactly take well to what they've just seen. Ella shrugged, her grin never faltering. Most people don't have to patch up injured wolves turned men on their back doorstep. Guess I'm just built different. That earned her a real laugh, low, warm, and entirely unexpected. It sent a shiver down her spine, though she told herself it was just the chill of the night air. You're not what I expected, Alaric admitted, his voice quieter now. Ella's grin softened, and she met his gaze with a curious tilt of her head. Yeah, well, you're not exactly what I expected either. He opened his mouth to respond, but she cut him off, pointing a finger at him. Though I have to say, she quipped, you're kind of setting the bar pretty high for dramatic forest encounters. The next time I run into a werewolf, they're going to have to bring their A game. Alaric shook his head, his expression caught between exasperation and amusement. You're impossible. And yet here you are, she shot back, her smile widening. For a moment, the weight of the strange, otherworldly moment seemed to lift, replaced by the easy, teasing rhythm that Ella seemed to bring with her wherever she went. Alaric found himself relaxing, despite his better judgment, the tension in his chest loosening as her laughter echoed softly through the glade. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't entirely sure if that was a bad thing. Alaric sighed, running a hand through his dark hair as he leaned against a tree at the edge of the glade. The sharp angles of his jaw caught the moonlight, but his expression was shadowed, tense. For a long moment he didn't say anything, his amber eyes fixed on a distant point beyond Ella's shoulder. She waited, arms crossed and eyebrow arched, clearly unimpressed with his brooding silence. You know, for a guy who just pulled off the most intense transformation I've ever seen, you're awfully tight-lipped. He glanced at her, his lips twitching in the faintest hint of a smile, before the weight of the moment dragged his features back into seriousness. This isn't a game, Ella, he said quietly, his voice low and firm. You shouldn't be here. She tilted her head, unfazed. You've mentioned that. A lot. But you still haven't told me why. He hesitated, his jaw tightening as if physically holding back words. Then, finally, he let out a breath and met her gaze. There's a lot you don't know, he began, his tone measured. Things about this forest, about the packs my pack, the Nightfang pack that aren't safe. Rogues like the one you saw earlier are just the beginning. Rogues, she repeated, testing the word. Like wolf outlaws? Something like that, he said, his expression hardening. They don't follow the rules of the packs. They're dangerous, unpredictable. And they've been encroaching on our territory more and more lately. She studied him, her gaze sharp despite the warmth in her tone. And what does that have to do with me? Alaric pushed off the tree, his broad shoulders tense as he took a step closer to her. Everything, he said, his voice dropping. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. If they had caught you but they didn't, she interrupted, lifting her chin. Because I stopped them. He shot back, his tone sharper now. And I can't guarantee I'll always be there to stop them again. You don't belong in this world, Ella. It's not safe for you. For a moment she didn't respond, her expression thoughtful as she processed his words. Then, to his utter disbelief, she shrugged. Okay, she said simply. Alaric blinked. Okay? Okay, she repeated, her tone light but her eyes steady. You've got dangerous wolves, rogue packs, territorial disputes. It's a whole supernatural soap opera. Got it. Ella, but, she continued, cutting him off, what you didn't explain is why you're so desperate to scare me off. Because I'm getting the feeling there's more to this than just dangerous woods and stay away for your own good. He froze, his amber eyes narrowing as he studied her. You're too stubborn for your own good, you know that. Yeah, she said with a grin, crossing her arms. I've heard that once or twice. But you're dodging the question. Alaric let out a low growl of frustration, his hands curling into fists at his sides. You don't understand what you're getting involved in. Then explain it to me, she said, her voice softer now, but no less determined. Because I'm not going to run off just because you told me to. He stared at her, his expression a mixture of exasperation and something else, something that almost looked like admiration. This isn't a fight you can win, he said finally, his voice quiet but weighted. Ella tilted her head, her grin softening into a smirk. Good thing I'm not here to fight, then. I'm here to help. Alaric shook his head, letting out a breathless laugh that held no humor. You're impossible. And yet, she said, taking a step closer, here you are, still trying to talk me out of it. The glade fell silent again, the tension between them crackling like static. Alaric opened his mouth as if to argue, but no words came. He wasn't sure whether to admire her resolve or curse it. Ella simply stood there, her arms crossed and her gaze steady, silently daring him to try again. And in that moment, Alaric realized two things. She wasn't going to back down, and whether he liked it or not, she was going to be a part of this world. The tension in the glade lingered, thick as the mist curling around their ankles. Alaric's jaw was set, his amber eyes sharp, but Ella stood her ground, arms crossed, and a mischievous spark in her gaze that he was beginning to recognize as her default state. She tilted her head, a playful grin spreading across her face. So she began, her tone light and casual. Are you more of a dog person or a cat person? Alaric blinked, caught completely off guard by the question. What? You know, she said, waving a hand as though the answer were obvious. If you weren't, part-time wolf, which team would you be on? Dogs or cats? His lips twitched, the barest hint of a smile threatening to break through his serious demeanor. Dogs, obviously. Obviously, Ella echoed, rolling her eyes dramatically. How original. Alaric raised an eyebrow. You're surprised? I don't know, she said with a shrug, her grin widening. I thought maybe you'd be one of those edgy, misunderstood types who secretly loves cats. Broody wolf guy with a soft spot for kittens that has a nice ring to it. Alaric let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Definitely not a cat person. Why not? She pressed, her curiosity genuine despite her teasing tone. They're unpredictable, he said after a moment, his voice laced with dry humor. And I don't trust anything that's too small to fight back. Ella snorted, covering her mouth with her hand to stifle the laugh that escaped. Wow. Big, scary werewolf scared of a house cat. That's a plot twist. I'm not scared of them, he corrected, his tone exasperated but amused. I just don't see the appeal. Oh, there's appeal, she said, nodding sagely. The little toe beans? The dramatic flair? Cats are basically tiny divas who know they run the world. Exactly, Alaric said, his smirk finally breaking through. They're too much work. Dogs are loyal. Cats demand a 5-star lifestyle and still act like they're doing you a favor by existing. Ella laughed, the sound bright and unguarded, and Alaric felt a strange warmth settle in his chest. Well, she said, her grin softening, you can't exactly talk. You're not exactly low maintenance yourself. His eyebrows lifted. Is that so? Oh, absolutely, she said, nodding with mock seriousness. The brooding? The mysterious warnings? The whole I'm too dangerous to be around vibe. You're a walking soap opera, Alaric, and I'm pretty sure you're high maintenance. For a moment he was silent, staring at her with an intensity that made her grin falter ever so slightly. Then he leaned in, just enough to close the distance between them. "I'm not high maintenance," he said, his voice low and smooth. "I'm just complicated." Ella swallowed, her breath catching at the shift in his tone. But before she could respond, the playful glint returned to his eyes, and he straightened, stepping back. "Still not a cat person, though," he added, his smirk firmly back in place. Ella exhaled, shaking her head as her grin returned. "Good to know," she said lightly, though her heart was still racing. The tension between them had eased, replaced by a strange, playful energy that felt almost comfortable, like they were old friends instead of two people who had stumbled into each other's lives by sheer chance. And for a brief moment, standing in the glow of the moonlit glade, the rest of the world faded away. The glade fell into an easy silence, the kind that felt heavier with things left unsaid. The silver light of the moon bathed the clearing, softening the edges of the world and painting the moment in shades of something close to magical. Ella shifted her weight, glancing down at her boots before looking back up at Alaric. He stood a few steps away, his posture relaxed, but his gaze was fixed on her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "Well," she said, breaking the silence with a forced casualness, "this has been enlightening. I'll definitely think twice before wandering off into the woods next time." He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable, but somehow softer than before. "That would be wise." Her lips twitched into a small smile. "You know, you could just say I'm glad you're okay like a normal person. It wouldn't kill you." Alaric's mouth curved in a faint smirk, but he didn't take the bait. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze searching hers for a long, quiet moment. "You should go," he said finally, his voice low and steady. Ella frowned, her resolve flickering for just a second before she nodded. "Right. I'll just head back to my normal, non-werewolf-infested life." She turned, taking a step toward the edge of the glade, but something stopped her. A strange pull, like an invisible thread tying her to the spot. She hesitated, glancing back over her shoulder. "Alaric," she said softly, her tone stripped of its usual humor. He met her gaze, his expression as guarded as ever. "Thanks," she said, her lips curling into a small, genuine smile. "For saving me. Twice now." Something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of warmth breaking through the amber intensity. He nodded once, a subtle movement that carried more weight than words. Without another word, Ella turned and started down the faint path leading out of the glade. Each step felt heavier than it should have, the forest pressing in around her as the distance between them grew. Alaric watched her go, his arms crossed and his jaw tight. He told himself it was for the best, that keeping her at arm's length was the only way to keep her safe. But as her figure disappeared into the shadows, he couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible had shifted between them. A thread, thin but unbreakable, tied their paths together in a way he didn't fully understand. Ella's pendant glowed faintly against her chest as she walked, the warmth of it mirroring the strange flutter in her heart. She couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words, but she felt it. The quiet, undeniable connection that had sparked in that moonlit glade. Neither of them said it aloud, but the bond between them was there, unspoken but impossible to ignore. And as Alaric turned back to the shadows of the forest, he realized with a heavy certainty that their lives would never be the same. Chapter 5. Threads unraveling. I leaned against the edge of the massive oak table in the Moonshadow Council Hall. Arms crossed, jaw tight, Celine was pacing like a caged wolf, a sharp, deliberate rhythm that matched the cutting tone of her voice. "You've been distracted, Alaric," she said, her silver eyes narrowing at me. "More than usual. Care to explain?" I didn't flinch under her glare, though the air felt heavy with her frustration. "I don't owe you an explanation, Celine. We've already discussed the alliance." Her laugh was cold, devoid of humor. "Don't patronize me. This isn't about the alliance, it's about you. Your head isn't in this, and we both know it." I met her gaze, the flicker of vulnerability behind her sharp words not lost on me. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" She shot back, her voice rising. Because from where I stand, it looks like you're putting this entire agreement at risk. I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. The alliance is secure, you're overthinking it. She stopped pacing and faced me, her shoulders squared, her expression unyielding. Do you think this is easy for me? Ulrich, do you think I want to be here, negotiating with a pack that looks at me like I'm just my father's shadow? That gave me pause. Celine, no, she interrupted, her voice cracking just slightly. I've worked for this. Fought for it. And I'll be damned if I let it fall apart because you've suddenly decided to play lone wolf. Her words hit harder than I wanted to admit. Celine was many things: proud, stubborn, often impossible, but beneath all of that was a fierce determination I couldn't ignore. I'm not backing out, I said, my tone softer now. I know what's at stake. She tilted her head, her eyes searching mine. Then act like it, she said quietly. For a moment the room fell silent, the tension settling into something less volatile but no less heavy. Celine straightened, her usual commanding presence sliding back into place like armor. Don't make me regret trusting you, Ulrich, she said, her voice cool but laced with something that sounded almost like hope. And just like that, she was gone, leaving me alone with the weight of her words. The smell of antiseptic and hay lingered in the clinic as I finished stitching up a nervous golden retriever. His tail wagged weakly, his big brown eyes watching me like I'd just performed a miracle. There you go, buddy, I said softly, giving his head a gentle pat. You're all patched up. Dr. Langston leaned against the counter, his sharp eyes studying me over the rim of his glasses. That's the third time this week, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Third time for what? I asked, avoiding his gaze as I scratched behind the dog's ears. That an animal that should have been sedated went completely calm the second you touched it, he said, crossing his arms. Care to explain? I shrugged, feigning nonchalance. Maybe I just have a calming presence? Animals love me. Dr. Langston didn't look convinced. Ella, he said, his voice softening, this isn't normal. I finally looked up at him, my fingers brushing the pendant around my neck. What are you saying, Doc? That I'm some kind of animal whisperer? He sighed, shaking his head. I don't know, but I've been noticing changes in you, your energy, the way animals respond to you. Even your patients are healing faster than they should. I tried to laugh it off, but the weight of his words settled in my chest. It's probably just a fluke. You're overthinking it. Am I? He asked, echoing Celine's earlier words. Ella, you've been looking pale lately, and you're working yourself to exhaustion. Whatever's going on, it's taking a toll on you. I opened my mouth to argue, but a soft whine from the golden retriever cut me off. His head nudged my hand, his eyes pleading, and without thinking, I placed my palm against his side. A strange warmth spread through me, soft and electric, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The dog let out a contented sigh, his entire body relaxing beneath my touch. Dr. Langston's eyes widened, his expression shifting from concern to something closer to awe. That, he said slowly, is what I'm talking about. I pulled my hand back as if burned, my heart racing. It's nothing, I said quickly, though even I didn't believe it. It's not nothing, he said firmly, and you can't keep ignoring it. Whatever this is, Ella, you need to figure it out before it figures you out. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me like a storm cloud. The truth was, I'd felt it too, the strange, inexplicable energy, the way animals seemed to gravitate toward me like I was their anchor, and the pendant around my neck glowed faintly, as if to remind me that this was only the beginning. I leaned back against the counter in my clinic, my arms crossed as Alaric stood awkwardly near the door, looking like he'd rather face a pack of rogue wolves than be here. His eyes flicked to the patchwork quilt covering the couch, to the shelves lined with jars of animal vitamins, and finally, to me. You know, I began, breaking the silence. Most people knock before barging into someone's workplace. His gaze narrowed slightly, but there was a flicker of amusement in his expression. I wasn't sure you'd let me in. I raised an eyebrow. What gave you that idea? The fact that you've been lurking in the shadows like some kind of moody forest spirit. I don't lurk, he said, deadpan. Oh, you absolutely lurk, I shot back, crossing my arms. You've got a whole lurk and brood thing going on. It's your brand. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I'm not here to argue. Could have fooled me, I muttered, but I stepped back to let him fully into the room. Fine. What do you want? Alaric hesitated, his eyes flicking to the golden retriever snoozing on the couch, a recent patient of mine. And then back to me. I needed to talk to you. I tilted my head, trying to ignore the way his tone made my stomach flutter. About what? The weather? Rogue wolves? Your preferred brand of shampoo? He gave me a look that clearly said you're impossible, but I'd gotten used to that expression from him. This isn't a joke, Ella, he said, his voice quieter now. You've been noticed. I frowned, my teasing slipping away. Noticed? By who? By Lucien, he said, the name dropping into the room like a stone. I blinked. Lucien? Let me guess he's not someone I want to invite to a dinner party. Alaric's jaw tightened. He's the leader of the rogues, and he knows about you. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to stay calm. Knows what? That I like long walks in the woods and patching up injured animals? Knows that you're different. Alaric said, his gaze meeting mine. I let out a dry laugh, though it came out shakier than I intended. Different. That's one way to put it. His expression softened, and for a moment he almost looked concerned. You're more connected to this world than you realize, Ella, and that makes you a target. I stared at him, trying to process his words. Okay, so what's the plan? Do I move to some remote island and live off coconuts for the rest of my life? He smirked, just a little. You're not exactly the island type. No kidding, I said, shaking my head. But seriously, Alaric, why are you telling me this now? Why not just keep lurking in the shadows and let me stumble into danger like usual? Because I care, he said, the words slipping out before he could stop them. We both froze. He looked like he wanted to take the words back, but they hung in the air, impossible to ignore. I cleared my throat, trying to shake off the sudden tension. Well, I said, forcing a grin. I guess I should be flattered. Alaric sighed, running a hand through his hair. This isn't about flattery, Ella. It's about keeping you safe. And I appreciate that, I said softly, surprising even myself with the sincerity in my voice. But I'm not going to run. If this Lucien guy is as bad as you say, then I need to know what I'm dealing with. You don't understand how dangerous he is, Alaric said, his voice sharp. Then explain it to me, I shot back, my own frustration bubbling to the surface. He stared at me for a long moment, his amber eyes searching mine. Finally he exhaled, his shoulders slumping just slightly. You really don't know how to back down, do you? Not my style, I said with a small grin. His lips twitched, and for a moment, I thought he might smile. But the weight of the conversation settled between us again, and he straightened, his expression serious. I'll tell you everything, he said finally. But you have to promise me something. What's that? Stay close, he said, his voice quiet but firm. And trust me. I hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. Then I nodded, meeting his gaze with all the determination I could muster. Deal, I said. And in that moment, I realized just how far I'd already fallen into his world. Chapter 6. Shadows and Obsessions. The air smelled of smoke and fury. Celine's command tent was alive with the buzzing tension of too many alphas in one place. Her silver eyes burned with a cold fire as she leaned over the massive table, her fingertips pressing into the worn surface of the map spread before her. I stayed quiet, tucked near the edge of the tent, trying not to draw attention. Celine had called this emergency meeting after Lucien's latest stunt, and judging by the grim faces around the table, he'd succeeded in rattling everyone. He's testing us, Celine said, her voice sharp as steel, pushing our boundaries, trying to see how far we'll let him go. A grizzled alpha from the southern pack growled, slamming his fist onto the table. He torched one of our outposts. He's not testing, he's declaring war. Celine didn't flinch, If anything, her resolve seemed to harden. "Lucien doesn't do anything without a reason," she said, her gaze cutting through the room. "This wasn't random." "You're saying this was calculated?" another alpha asked, his tone laced with skepticism. Celine straightened, her presence commanding as she folded her arms. "I'm saying Lucien is too smart to waste resources on a whim. He's drawing us out, looking for a weakness." I caught Alaric's eye across the room, his expression a mix of brooding and concern. He stood near the edge of the gathering, his arms crossed as he listened. "And what's your plan, Voss?" one of the younger alphas sneered. "You think you can out-strategize someone like Lucien?" Celine's jaw tightened, but she didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she leaned forward, her voice low but dangerous. "My plan," she said, "is to remind Lucien that the Nightfang pack is not to be trifled with." There was a murmur of agreement around the room, though I couldn't help but notice the unease in some of their faces. "Revenge won't win this war," Alaric said suddenly, his deep voice cutting through the noise. Celine turned to him, her gaze sharp. "And what would you suggest, Kane?" "Waiting until he burns down the rest of our territory." "I'm saying we need to be smart about this," he replied evenly. "Lucien's goading you. If you react without thinking, you're playing into his hands." The room fell silent, the tension between them crackling like static. Finally, Celine stepped back, exhaling sharply. "You're right," she admitted, though the words sounded like they cost her. "But we can't sit idle either. If Lucien wants a fight, we'll give him one on our terms." The firelight danced across Lucien Drake's face, casting sharp shadows over his angular features. He lounged in his makeshift throne, carved from rough stone, and draped with the pelts of his conquests, looking every bit the rogue king he fancied himself to be. I'd only seen him once before, from a distance, and even then, his presence had been enough to send a chill down my spine. Now, seeing him like this, smirking, dangerous, utterly in control, it was easy to understand why the packs feared him. Lucien twirled a blade between his fingers, the metal catching the firelight. "So," he drawled, his voice smooth but laced with menace, "tell me about the healer." A weary wolf at his side shifted nervously. "She's different, not like the others." Lucien's smirk widened, his amber eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Different how?" "Word is she can heal with a touch," the wolf said, his voice low. "Animals, people, maybe even wolves." Lucien leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Interesting," he murmured. "She's close to Alaric," the wolf added. "The Moonshadow Alpha." Lucien's smile faltered for just a moment before it returned, sharper now. "Of course she is," he said, his tone dripping with amusement. "The brooding prince always did have a penchant for strays." The wolf hesitated. "Do you think she's one of them?" Lucien's gaze darkened, his smirk fading as he leaned back in his throne. "Not yet," he said, "but she will be." He tapped the blade against his knee, his mind clearly working through whatever twisted plan was forming behind those sharp eyes. "Bring me more information," he said finally, his voice low but commanding. "I want to know everything about her, where she came from, what she can do, and what it will take to break her." The wolf nodded quickly and scurried out of the room, leaving Lucien alone with the firelight and his thoughts. For a moment he sat in silence, his expression unreadable. Then he let out a low chuckle, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. "Oh, little healer," he murmured, his voice soft but dangerous. "You're going to be so much fun." The clinic was quiet, save for the soft hum of the overhead lights and the rhythmic tapping of my foot against the tiled floor. I stood by the counter, arms crossed, watching as Alaric leaned against the doorframe like he had all the time in the world. "You can't just show up here unannounced every time you feel like brooding," I said, my tone laced with mock exasperation. "I don't brood," he shot back, his lips twitching in that infuriating almost smile. "Oh, you absolutely brood," I countered, stepping closer. "You've got it down to an art form. I'm surprised you don't have a medal for it." Alaric chuckled, low and quiet, the sound rolling through the room and settling in my chest. "And you don't know when to quit, do you?" "Not really," I admitted with a grin. "It's part of my charm." He straightened, his amber eyes locking onto mine, and suddenly the playful energy between us shifted. The air grew heavier, charged with something unspoken but impossible to ignore. "Ella," he said softly, my name like a whisper on his lips. "Him?" I managed, my heart hammering against my ribs. His gaze dropped to my lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back up to meet my eyes. "You shouldn't make this harder than it already is." "Make what harder?" I asked, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. He took a step closer, and I swore the temperature in the room rose 10 degrees. "Staying away," he admitted, his voice low and rough. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The space between us seemed to shrink until it was practically non-existent, and my mind raced with a million reasons why this was a terrible idea. And then he kissed me. It wasn't tentative or shy, it was like a dam breaking, all heat and urgency and unspoken feelings pouring into that one moment. His hands cupped my face, strong and sure, pulling me closer as his lips moved against mine with a fervor that left me dizzy. I responded without thinking, my hands gripping the front of his shirt, holding on like he was the only solid thing in the room. The world fell away, leaving just the warmth of his touch and the intoxicating way he made me feel like I was standing on the edge of something vast and wonderful. His scent earthy and wild, like the forest after a storm, filled my senses, and I leaned into him, my fingers tangling in the fabric of his shirt, as his lips teased mine with a combination of softness and intensity that made my knees weak. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, he pulled away. I blinked, breathless and disoriented, as he stepped back, his hands dropping to his sides. "I shouldn't have done that," he muttered, his voice tight with something that sounded suspiciously like regret. I stared at him, my heart still racing. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Ella, no," I interrupted, stepping forward as anger and confusion bubbled to the surface. "You don't get to do that, kiss me like the world is ending, and then just pull away like it didn't mean anything." "It does mean something," he said, his eyes flashing with an intensity that made my breath catch. "That's the problem. Alaric." "I can't," he said, cutting me off. His voice softened, and for the first time I saw the vulnerability he worked so hard to hide. "I can't let you get hurt because of me." I opened my mouth to argue, but he was already moving toward the door, his jaw set and his eyes shadowed with guilt. "Stay safe, Ella," he said quietly before slipping out into the night, leaving me alone in the clinic with my heart in my throat and my thoughts spinning out of control. I pressed my fingers to my lips, the heat of his kiss still lingering there, and let out a shaky breath. "Yeah," I muttered to the empty room. "Like staying safe is an option after that." Thank you for joining us on this thrilling journey so far, but trust me, the story is far from over. The twists, the revelations, and the emotions are only just beginning to unravel. You don't want to miss what happens next. It's where the narrative truly comes alive. Continue this adventure seamlessly by heading to the next part of the audiobook, where the story deepens and the stakes get even higher. Click the link in the description to dive straight in. Don't wait. Your next chapter awaits, and you won't want to miss a single moment of it.